Shule stamps were up there in that exact region, and every indigenous person now who goes up there is shot. So they're actually the Mesoamerican rubber ball game is eventually going to die because they can't make the rubber balls anymore because they can't go to this region. It's absolutely true. Yeah.
Hi, we're back. I hope that you got a sense of the tremendous depth of knowledge that both John Hart and Rex Kuntz have and shared with us about where Latin America is going. But what I want to do now and what we need to do to finish up is move away from thinking about Latin America in that cosmic and futuristic sense and look back at what we've done during the course of the semester and think about not so much where we're going, but where we've been. And we certainly have been all over the map and all over the place in terms of Latin America, in terms of its history, and also in terms of approaches, ways to study Latin America. And so what I want to do in the time that remains today is to review the important themes from the semester. I will particularly focus on themes and issues from the second half of the semester, but I do want to talk briefly about some of what we covered in the first part of the semester, because that certainly provided a basis for what we've gone on to do. So let me get to that, and let me start by talking about the topics, and I'll talk very briefly about the topics that we covered in the first part of the course. We started out by talking about, and this was with Professor Kuntz actually, we talked about early peoples, cultures, and civilizations of Latin America, particularly Mesoamerica. And we looked at the rise of some of those civilizations. And that subject, of course, is important in and of itself because we do know a lot about the history of the major indigenous cultures and civilizations. But it's also important because we really cannot understand colonialism without understanding what it was that the Spaniards came in contact with. Because there's nothing about what the Spaniards did that was wholly independent from the nature of the societies as they found them here. And so that's, I think, what makes that topic so important in terms of laying a basis for understanding the later development of Latin America. And as John Hart pointed out, indigenous culture, actually both John Hart and Rex Kuntz mentioned today that indigenous culture in Mexico, and this would be true in other parts of Latin America where indigenous societies still demographically make up an important part of certain countries, that indigenous culture and society is still alive, it's very vibrant, it's very important, and these are the roots, the pre-Hispanic era provided the roots from which today's indigenous cultures and societies have sprung. We also talked about early on about defining and conceptualizing Latin America. We talked about Latin America as a geographic concept more than anything else, what it spans, the region that it spans geographically, and I talked about regions within Latin America. But I also tried to make the point that in order to understand Latin America's complexity, we need to understand that it really isn't just one place. It's made up of lots of different places, cultures, and histories, and therefore we really do need a multiplicity of approaches in order to begin to get a handle on just describing this place. And from that, we can then move on to analyzing many different aspects of Latin American history, culture, and society. We then talked about the European side of Latin America, in a sense. We talked about Spanish history. And one of the points I tried to make there and really emphasize does have to do with the Reconquest, this war between Christian Iberians and Islamic forces, and the way it was that the impact of the Reconquest would then influence many different aspects of the way the Spanish carried out their conquests. So we talked about Spanish history, we talked about conquest, and we talked about colonial rule. Spanish law provided a base on which colonial policies were built. And one of the themes I think that has run through the whole course, I haven't drawn a whole lot of attention to it, in part because I think it's somewhat self-evident, in part because we've had so many different things that we've talked about. But certainly running through the entire semester is the idea that colonial rule had many long-lasting implications. And just as we can't understand contemporary indigenous societies without understanding their pre-Hispanic origins, I really would argue that we cannot understand Latin America in 2007 without understanding the period of colonial rule. Because not only did the legal and political systems that were part of colonial rule shape what then happened in the 19th and 20th centuries, but I think the very nature of Latin American society in its racial and ethnic heterogeneity, in its grappling with adapting to Catholicism, yet changing Catholicism in the process, and in the development of an economy that was shaped so much by externalities, and an economy that was so marked by unequal distribution of wealth. All those features of Latin American society and culture are traceable back to colonial rule, and so I think that the implications and consequences of colonial rule were deep and long-lasting. Professor Lois Zamora then discussed the Baroque and colonial artists, emphasizing especially their focus on religious themes, and she discussed many of those themes in conjunction with particular examples of colonial Baroque art. And that lecture was important because it introduced the theme of culture. But I think it also is important because it reflects something interesting about colonial art and culture. And that is that while there was popular art and culture, it's a lot hard to recover that kind of art from that distant past. But also more elite, more established art that is tied into the most important institutions of society. That's the art that has lasted, and that is the art that many people, especially through churches, came into contact with. And the reason why I think that's important is that that art spoke to people's religious and spiritual concerns, but it did not at all speak to the conditions of their daily lives. And I think that's interesting and important because it tells us something about the art, but it also tells us something about the ways that Latin Americans, through the images that were around them, might understand power relations in their society. We moved from Baroque art to a description of the history of Afro-Latin America. Phil Howard from the History Department talked about the experience of enslavement and how the institution of slavery was rooted in complex economic relations that involved Latin America centrally, but we're not limited to Latin America, because when we talk about slavery, we're talking about Latin America, we're talking about North America, we're talking about Europe and Africa. And while conquest, I think, is certainly conquest by its very nature is a multicultural, multi-hemispheric phenomenon, the phenomena that's most important and best illustrates the idea of Latin America as having a reality that is both hemispheric and global really is slavery. Slavery was and is crucially important in the emergence of a truly global economy. It is very important to remember that globalization is not a product of the 1990s or first decade of the 21st century. Globalization has a long, deep history. Latin America is an important part of that history, and slavery, the enslavement of African people and use of their labor, is a very important part of that history as well. In that same class, we also heard about African American influences on contemporary Latin American, especially Caribbean music. We got a sense, as we did from Lois Zamora's lecture, of the complex relationship between history and culture. And another theme that I'll just mention briefly here, which I think has emerged as we've heard about art, music, and literature, is that art, music, and literature are all aspects of culture, and they all have their own histories. But art, music, and literature are not all on the same timetable of change. They may all respond to similar historical developments and influences, but they also work somewhat autonomously, in a sense, to their own rules, the rules or logic of each particular aspect of culture. We then talked about the late colonial period as well as independence. The independence period, of course, was crucial for Latin America, just as it was for the United States. We are talking about a violent break with an imperial power. Virtually all of Spanish America became independent in the period between 1810 and 1825. But as the lecture suggested, and as your text also suggests, one of the things that's most interesting about independence in Latin America is that you have it occurring in a relatively short span of time, yet the pathways for independence, how independence played out in different regions and countries, was very different. What happened in Mexico as compared to Argentina, as compared to Colombia and Venezuela, or Brazil. Each place is very different. In each place, we're talking about different historical actors, different groups within society that play a role. And sometimes different outcomes. Yes, independence in each of those places, but the history of the post-independence period in each of those places would be somewhat different. And at this point, we see one of the ideas that comes back at later points in the semester, but was most especially illustrated by John Hart's comments today, and that is that Mexico, as much as it is a part of Latin America, in many ways has a history that is at variance with most of the rest of Latin America, and that variation is in part explained by Mexico's relationship to the United States. But it's explained by other factors as well, because the point I'm really getting at here is that in independence, we really see in Mexico an independence movement that truly begins as a social movement from below. That is, this is not simply an elite-led movement coming from the top that's a debate or discussion about trade and taxes. In Mexico, the independence movement is a discussion of the rights of people, who should rule, and why. And thus in Mexico, independence began as a social movement. Didn't end that way. But because many of the social issues that framed the emergence of the independence movement in Mexico were not addressed by independence and the post-independence political system, those issues would emerge again in 1910 in the Mexican Revolution. From thinking about independence, we then heard from Tom O'Brien about the political history of 19th century Latin America. I'm sure your heads were somewhat spinning with the complexity of the number of places, political parties, and political actors that Professor O'Brien talked about. One of the important issues he talked about, which you should reflect back upon, is this issue of the conflict between liberals and conservatives. It is important to remember that the definition of liberal and conservative in the 19th century Latin American context has relatively little to do with what we in the U.S. would think of as liberal and conservative in our political system today. It has a lot to do with the issue of what kind of government Latin American countries thought, and Latin American political actors thought they should have. Should it be a more centralized government? Should it be a government more rooted in the principles and structure of colonial institutions? Should it be a more federalized government that is giving more power to the state and local levels? And should Latin American governments follow non-Spanish, non-Latin American political traditions and develop more representative and more quote-unquote modern, that is modern for the time, types of political systems? Those questions about the nature of governments were crucial to the political split between liberals and conservatives. Economic questions about how and whether Latin America should modernize its economies also fed into the liberal-conservative debates, as did the issue of the role of the Catholic Church. That part of the semester ended with a lecture by John Hart about the Mexican Revolution of 1910. In that lecture, we got the sense that the revolution was the culmination of the impossibility of reaching some sort of consensus between liberal and conservative forces in Mexico. It was the culmination and expression of social misery that had not been resolved neither by the independence movement in Mexico itself nor the governments, particularly the government of Porfirio Diaz that ruled just prior to the outbreak of revolution. And the revolution was also an expression, in a sense, of the modernizing and growing sophistication of the Mexican cultural apparatus. What was and is fascinating about the Mexican Revolution is that it both attempted to address these very serious social issues, yet the revolution as a political phenomenon also attempted to institutionalize itself. And as that happened, and that happened in the form of the creation of the political party that would become known as the PRI, as the PRI institutionalized itself and really became the government, at some point, and I think this point was probably earlier on than was apparent as events unfolded, especially in Mexico in the second half of the 20th century. At some point, the contradiction, even paradox, of institutionalizing a revolution became apparent. Because a revolution, by its very nature, is not an institution and cannot fully be institutionalized. In order to carry out the goals of a revolution, you have to have a government. And what was interesting in Mexico was the way that even with a radical change in government, there was a sense in which there was a kind of continuity between the pre- and post-revolutionary governments in which it is not inappropriate to observe, with all the change that took place, especially in the institutional structures of the Mexican government. Nonetheless, it's not inappropriate to observe that the more things change, the more they stay the same. We then got to the second part of the semester and began to think about Latin America in the 20th century and looked at and stayed with this theme of the politics and economics of Latin America in the 20th century. Tom O'Brien and Professor Adriana Kugler of the Economics Department both brought our attention to issues of inequality, political change and instability, the changing ways that Latin American leaders and politicians have framed issues. One of the important points that Professor O'Brien made was that in the 20th century, Latin American politics in many ways remained as polarized as it had been in the 19th century in the post-independent period, but the issues at play, the parties playing a role, the political actors, and the ideas they espoused were all different. So that he was able to show the way that political ideas developed, in some cases in response to political ideas, the importation of political ideas from the outside, socialism, anarchism, Marxism, neoliberalism. But in all cases, no matter where the ideas, the political ideas that Latin Americans debated came from, those debates were and are always on Latin American terms. That is, these were not theoretical discussions about the nature of socialism. These were discussions about how do we address the distribution of wealth in our own countries. So Latin American leaders, while they may have been influenced by ideas and policies from the outside, were always taking those and reformulating them in ways and in language that spoke to Latin Americans and that addressed the lived realities of people in their everyday lives. Professor Kugler talked about the economic history of Latin America, and I've already gone over her main points. I don't want to repeat that, except to say that I think she did a very effective job of framing the issue of inequality and the different ways that economists and politicians influenced by economists and economic theories have tried to deal with the issue of maldistribution of resources and the many consequences that maldistribution has for both individuals and families. I think, again, that she did a very good job of not only articulating what that issue is in economic terms, but in talking about how there have been a whole series of solutions considered, tried, yet the problems are intractable, and the policy discussions will go on. Unless utopia comes tomorrow, and I feel safe in assuring you that that's unlikely to happen. We next moved from economics and politics to culture. And culture became a very important theme in our discussions in this part of the semester. Mark Zimmerman from the Department of Modern and Classical Languages discussed the whole issue and set of approaches that go by the loosely defined term cultural studies. Cultural studies scholars are people who primarily study literature, though they may study other aspects of culture as well. But while cultural studies scholars tend to be rooted in literature as their original discipline and object of study, they are not literary scholars only, or not literary scholars per se. They're certainly interested in literature, but what they're really interested in is looking at the relationship between literature and society. In talking about cultural studies scholars who look at Latin America, he was asking us to think about literary writing and how it helps define Latin America from within and without. How do Latin Americans understand what Latin America is? How do non-Latin Americans ask that same question? The issue of how we defined as broadly as possible, the issue of how we think about and define Latin America from both within and without is in part a historical question, because ideas of what Latin America is and its defining features have changed over time. But it is also, importantly, a cultural question. How do Latin Americans understand themselves, and how do they express those understandings? His lecture provided insight into many different concepts used by Latin Americans to grasp the local, the national, and history and culture. He talked about modernity, ethnicity, hybridity, as well as talking about some of the many social and cultural movements that regions within Latin America have spawned. In that same class, I began to discuss an area we had not yet touched much upon, and that was Central America. We have talked a lot about Mexico this semester. We have talked at times about Brazil and Argentina. But I wanted us to focus some and spend some time on Central America, because while it is often perceived as a peripheral region, its political history has been very important in U.S.-Latin American relations. And Central America, as I tried to show, has been very important economically to the U.S. as well. I also began to talk about gender roles and the history of indigenous women. And the connection between those two topics was through Guatemala. Guatemala is the largest and most politically dominant of Central American countries. It has a population that is half indigenous, that is Maya. And it's had a very extreme political history, as I talked about. And one of the things I wanted to do as I talked about gender was to connect political history with everyday life by taking a look at women's roles and gender roles as these play out in daily life. That lecture about indigenous women took me about 3 classes to get through with the various other topics that we've been talking about, so I'll come back to that as I go through some of the rest of the topics that have been covered. We heard from Andrew Chestnut, also of the History Department, who talked to us about the history of religion in Latin America. And I think that was a very useful and insightful lecture, because I think unless you've really thought about the history of religion in Latin America, you hear the term Latin America and the word Catholic automatically comes into one's mind when we talk about religion. Religion, of course, is a very important part of culture. And religion is an area of Latin American life where we really see the past and present interacting in all sorts of ways. But Andrew pointed out that this assumption that Latin America is solely Catholic is incorrect. that there is a tremendous competition in the contemporary Latin American world between Protestants and Catholics. But he also pointed out to us that African and native forms of spirituality continue to play an important role in religious practice. And that is a really important point about contemporary Latin America. That is, Afro-Latin Americans, indigenous Latin Americans aren't going away at all. Their cultures are not disappearing. Their cultures have changed and transformed. But as people and as cultural groupings, they are not disappearing. And their forms of work, art, and spirituality continue to play an important role in Latin American societies today. And that as we understand Latin America, we need to recognize that, because when we look at Latin America, we are not only talking about theoretical debates about neoliberalism and what's happening to the Latin American economy on a macro scale. A lot of other things are going on the ground in terms of daily life, and we need to understand the relationship between some of these larger economic and political issues which so dominate what we read and hear about Latin America. We need to move from that to the experience of Latin Americans themselves in their own countries, in their own societies, in their own times and spaces. I did come back to the discussion of Indigenous women's history. I talked about some of the important concepts that can be used in order to examine that as an area of study. I talked about the concept of agency, and I talked also about a little bit about hierarchy. That is, that gender relations are hierarchical. Another way of saying that is to say that they are asymmetrical. And one of the ideas that I would like to emphasize here is that in terms of women's history, you can have a gender asymmetry, yet you can have agency for women at the same time. And the issue then becomes how to draw a portrait of that complexity and how to understand women's lives in that intersection of asymmetry and agency. And the ways I tried to do that were by talking about the history of labor, women's political organization and activities, and their roles in family life. I tried to show that when we talk about Indigenous women, we are not just talking about a single group. I looked particularly at some of the larger indigenous groups in Mesoamerica and hope that I made clear that women's roles among Nahuas, Zapotecs, and Mayas are quite different. We shouldn't assume they're all the same. And I addressed some of the historical factors that influence those differences. I also talked about how indigenous women have been trying more consciously in the more recent past to create their own historical record. I had spoken about some of the source issues that I had in my own work and the kinds of sources that I turned to in order to write a history of women. But I do think it's interesting and important that Native women have been trying more consciously to develop a historical record. And in a sense, I think what we're seeing with that is a new kind of female culture that's emerging. And it will, in the years to come, be really interesting to see what women, especially in terms of their activism, what they do with that. Another way of approaching the study of culture is through thinking about culture and cultural expression as a way of telling stories. And we've heard two important lectures on that. One by Teresa Hernandez, also from Modern and Classical Languages, who discussed her ethnographic research in Monterrey, Mexico, focusing on the stories that people of that region tell about their history and identity. They tell stories in order to try to understand who they are, in order to try to understand who they are in relation to other Mexicans and how the history of their region is similar to or different from other parts of Mexico. They also tell those stories in order to try to make some sense of the complexity of their identities. People who've spoken to us about Mexico this semester have constantly remarked upon the ethnic mixing and complexity of Mexican society. And if the storytellers that Teresa Hernandez spoke about, if those storytellers are telling us nothing else, they are certainly telling us about the ways that they are trying to understand their own identities and what those identities mean in a world that's globalizing and in certain ways becoming more homogenous, economically, if not culturally. We also heard from Lois Zamora, who spoke about the storytelling of the writer who is arguably Latin America's greatest living writer, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and his greatest novel, 100 Years of Solitude. Garcia Marquez uses fiction to address the tragic political history of Colombia, and he uses the political history of Colombia as a way of talking. He uses Colombia as a way of talking about Latin America as a whole. Garcia Marquez suggests that a kind of what we might call hyperfiction, what is usually known as magical realism, is the only way to portray the intense drama and actual realities of Latin American history. In other words, what Garcia Marquez asserts in his writing, in his fictional writing, is that you have to go beyond the real in order to describe the real for Latin America, because the history is so big, so dramatic, so in a sense outsized, that the conventional categories of history, the conventional categories of language, don't do it justice. And magical realism, which many of you are familiar with, magical realism is a way of blending the magical into daily life, taking the magical as real in a sense. And Garcia Marquez and many other writers use that idea as a way to convey the intense drama of Latin American history. Since the time of the Latin American boom in writing, which is the 60s, the 1960s and 70s, more recent writers have been returning to a more social realist form of writing and have asserted that, no, we actually can understand the Latin American reality in terms of what's real. But their way of writing about the real and their assertion that the real is important does have to be understood as being in conversation with the idea of magical realism and with the influence of Garcia Marquez and other important writers of the period when he was at his most productive. Finally, we heard from Rex Kuntz, who discussed Latin American visual culture. He did that by way of a discussion of the most famous Mexican muralist, Diego Rivera. And Rex then spoke about changing art styles, what he referred to as la ruptura. And he also raised the whole question of indigenous arts as art, and talked about how he prefers the term visual culture to the term art, which I thought introduced a very useful way, a very useful concept for understanding cultural production more broadly. Especially because we live in a world where cultural production is not simply an elite activity for other wealthy people. Lastly, Professors Hart, Kuntz, and myself talked about where Latin America is going. We used the history to, if not forecast what is going to happen in the future, I think we used the history to suggest at least that we can comment about what is happening in Latin America right now and use our historical and other perspectives to gain a deeper understanding of where Latin America might be going, especially in terms of politics and the arts, but also in terms of Latin America's position in the world and its relationship, the relationship that Latin America, especially Mexico, but I would argue all of Latin America feels most intensely, and that is its relationship with the United States. In the second part of the semester, while we've continued to use history as a thread to pull the weaving of all the different ideas together, the concept of culture and its many forms and uses as a way of understanding Latin America has loomed large. And as important as I think it is to understand Latin America from a disciplinary base, I think an interdisciplinary perspective on any area of the world is perhaps the most useful way to gain an introduction to that area of the world. Let me stop there, see if you have any questions either on the points I've made now or on the lectures in the second half of the semester, if you have any questions that I can answer before we end for today. Okay, if there aren't any questions, I'm sure you'll think of some before the final. So get in touch, and otherwise, that is it for Latin American Studies 3300, Latin America, Hemispheric and Global Perspectives. Thank you all.